Sir,
Yes.
there are some new students who didn't get access to Canvas.
They have been emailing me, and so I have been, whoever emailed me, I have added them to Canvas. So I suppose we have no other option, but because I haven't received the second list, third list email lists, right? So I'm adding people individually. So any latecomers, if you email me, I will add you.
Sir, on the platform, if we go and try to download files, it's showing us that access is not enabled for me.
Are you registered on the platform?
Yes, sir, I'm registered on the platform. Yet, I think several students face that the files you're not able. We are able to see the files, but not able to download it.
It's showing unauthorized access for all, I guess.
This is, see, when I posted the problem set, there was initially a problem, but I fixed it, and on my computer, when I log in as a student, it worked. Has anybody been able to download the lecture slides and the problem set?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Yes,
Yes,
sir.
sir.
I have been able to.
Okay, so let me
Yes,
take
sir.
that. Let me start the lecture. I'll take those questions, logistical issues afterwards. Yeah. So let me start sharing the screen, and I will make sure to click these two because we will watch a video today. Okay, let me also open my whiteboard because I may be needing it a little bit. Okay, so are there any questions before I start? None?
So I have a question.
Yes.
In the first, can you go back to the slide where you calculated tax incidence?
That's quite a bit back.
Yeah, this one. So exactly.
Okay, yeah.
So when you said multiplying numerator and denominator by P upon Q,
Yeah.
so shouldn't we for quantity supplied, shouldn't we multiply by PT minus T for getting the elasticity of supply, and PE by Q for getting the elasticity of demand?
PT minus T. Yeah, you're right. The price, that's a good question. The price has to be the price which is relevant to the party, right? Whether it's a buyer or a seller. Let me just say one thing at this point, and I'll look at this and see if I want to modify it a little bit. If you're evaluating this formula starting from zero tax, right? So if you're starting from no tax at all, if a small tax is introduced, this is the way it will split up, right? Because then PT minus T, when evaluated at a tax rate of zero, the minus T will disappear. Yeah. So this should be accurate at low enough tax rates, or at least would be a good approximation. Let me think about the more general case where we start with a high T and then change around the T, right? The formula would be approximately close to this, but let me think and make the necessary. If a modification is needed, I will do that. That's an excellent question in terms of getting the nitty-gritties of the math right. But the larger idea remains that the elasticity of demand and supply, the relative elasticities of demand and supply, would have a significant effect on how the tax is divided. There was also a technical issue. I forgot to revisit that. Let me get to that. This was about consumer surplus. Again, I really should have been more meticulous, but let me, where is it? Over here. I think I'm quite happy with the expression which I had up there. Some of you were had a little bit of confusion over here. So this is the net utility for the consumers, right? This is how much utility they get from whatever amount they optimally consume or buy, and this is how much money they have to pay for it, right? No, it's not. So we start with a given price, fix the price P, okay? Now, once you fix the price P, the optimal quantity also becomes a unique number, right? That's QI, that's obtained from the QI of P function or the demand function. So P is a fixed number, and this QI of P is a fixed number as far as this calculation is concerned, right? So, so then what I said would be valid if I think of this expression, and if I think of UI of QI minus P times QI, with QI now as a variable, then I can differentiate and then integrate. That's allowed. The one thing we have to be careful about is the limits of the integral, right? The bounds of the integral. So it goes from 0, obviously, to whatever the relevant quantity is. At a given price, we are trying to calculate consumer surplus. So at that given price, the purchase is given by this amount, QI of P, right? So our integral has to go from 0 to that point. And with the graph, you can also relate it, right? If I fix the price at this line, it's not labeled properly, V of Q0. Think of that as the price. So this is our price line. At that price line, this is Q of P, right? This is how much the consumer will optimally buy. So when we are trying to think of consumer surplus, diagrammatically, we know that it's this triangle. And so what we are doing is we are integrating the gap between the demand curve and the price line, going from 0 to Q. So you can see that, the two things are linked. One of you suggested that, instead of QI of P, if I write some QI star or QI bar, some fixed QI, then that will be easier to understand. You can think of it that way, right? So this is just one particular quantity, which is how much the consumer buys at the given market price. And so our integration has to be up to that point. Yeah. So if you may want to write the notation somewhat differently, but what we're doing here is exactly what we're doing in the picture, right? We are looking at this gap, the total area under this curve from 0 to the point of purchase. Yes, whatever you want to call the point of purchase, you could call it. All right. So I hope that clarifies it. Let me move forward. I was hoping to start on the next topic today, but there are some remaining issues which I want to talk about as far as markets and efficiency is concerned. And so I will spend another lecture lingering on this topic.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
Sir, can you please show the slide where the definition of Pareto optimality was mentioned?
Where was it marked? Markets and efficiency, this one. Yes. Okay, that's the slide.
Yes, sir. No.
You want
Yes,
to be
this one.
this
So
one?
this one, sir, yeah, this slide.
Yeah,
So here we are defining Vi as Ui Qi minus Ti.
yeah,
And earlier, when we started with the course, we defined Vi as Ui Qi plus Mi, where Mi was the money spent on other goods.
right.
So, sir, where is the money, that money which we are not spending on this particular good, being reflected in this model?
Okay, so do one thing. Take this expression and just add yi to it. Okay,
Okay,
so you have qi plus yi minus ti.
okay,
So yi minus ti is exactly the money which is this guy has to in his pocket to spend on other things, right?
yes, sir.
So that'll map it back to the way we wrote it earlier.
Okay,
Now, yi is a given, it's a constant, it's a parameter, right? So in whatever maximization exercise we are going to do later, adding a constant here will not change anything, right?
yes, sir.
Without having written the yi, whatever the solution came out to be, it'll continue to be the same thing,
Okay, sir.
right?
Got it.
So
Thank you,
there's
sir.
a yi here. I just, to make it less cluttered, I just dropped it.
Got it, sir. Thank you, sir.
Okay, all right. Okay, so this all this discussion we had about a social planner versus a market,
Excuse me,
and
sir.
yes,
Can I ask a question?
sure.
So, when we did the maximization problem of a general welfare function, then you said that it gives the defines the Pareto efficient allocations. How is it?
Okay, let me answer that without going into too much detail. So let me tell you. Um, okay, I'll wave my hands a little bit, but I hope it'll be nearly convincing. All right. Okay. So think of there being one consumer and one firm, just to take a simple case, right? Just so that I can draw a picture. Nothing I'm going to say will hinge on that. If I can manage these things. I don't know. Okay. All right. So if we have a world of one firm and one consumer, that simple version of this model, you could think of there being some utility possibility frontier, as it's sometimes called. And so think of a picture. Oh, let's start a new page here. So think of a picture where we have, let's say, V, this consumer's utility on one axis, and pi on another axis, right? Now, if resources are allocated efficiently, or rather, if you think of all the feasible allocations, right, there will be something like this. Yeah. All the points here will correspond to some allocation. Yes. You just randomly keep creating allocations of the resources of the economy, you'll end up with a picture like this. Now, the boundary of that set, right, the set is this entire region. So what is the boundary of that set? The boundary of the set is the set of Pareto efficient allocations, right? If you take a point like this, A, the only way in which you can make the consumer better off is by making the firm worse off. Whereas if you started at a point like B, it's possible to move to a point like C, where both of them are better off, right? So B is not Pareto efficient, but A is Pareto efficient. A presents us with a trade-off between the interests of the two agents. Okay, so if we want to find all the points on this boundary, right? So let's call that the set curly P. It's a set of all Pareto efficient allocations and the utility vectors that it gives rise to. So if you take a social welfare function, yes, which has, suppose we have chosen a social welfare function, right? I probably should have drawn it with a different color, like blue. So that social welfare function will have what we may call indifference curves, right? The set of combinations of V and pi between which the planner is indifferent, right? So once you specify a particular social welfare function, it will generate indifference curves like this, all right? So that social planner would want to choose this point, which is the point of tangency, right? Between the social welfare function's indifference curves and the Pareto frontier of what is feasible, or the utility possibility frontier, right? Okay, now suppose I've chosen one particular social welfare function, and if I try to optimize the allocation with respect to that, I end up with a point like A, right? Now, if I choose a different social welfare function, let's say marked by green, my picture is looking terrible, so please excuse that. There'll be a different set of indifference curves and a different point of tangency, right? Once again, once we choose the green social welfare function, its point of tangency with the utility possibility frontier will give us what this planner would choose, right? And now we can play around with various social welfare functions. Each of them will lead to some point of tangency with the utility possibility frontier, right? So if you consider all social welfare functions, the various points of tangencies will basically span the entire utility possibility frontier, or the set of Pareto efficient points. So that's the idea.
Okay, sir. Yes, sir. I got it.
Okay. Drawing software is not cooperating with me very well today. All right. So we discussed, in this very partial equilibrium context with a somewhat simplified model, we discussed the idea that resource allocation by a competitive market will be Pareto efficient, right? No planner will want to change around in this setting, will want to change around the quantities, the physical quantities and resources. They may want to change around the monetary transfers for distributed reasons, right? Now, this is of course, one of the most famous quotes in economics. It goes back to Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, where he says that it is not for the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard to their self-interest. Every individual intends only his own security, only his own gain, and he is in this led by an invisible hand to promote an end which was no part of his intention. By pursuing his own interest, he frequently promotes that of society more effectually than when he really intends to promote it. So basically the idea is that even if economic agents are selfish, provided they're interacting through these free markets with flexible prices, somehow the resource allocation that arises from these millions of selfish individuals trying to pursue their own utility or profit, the social allocation is good in a particular sense, right? So the more general version of that, the modern, more techie version of that is the first fundamental theorem of welfare economics. Every market allocate, more pithily put, every market allocation is Pareto efficient. That's the idea. So there are two sort of remarkable aspects of markets that, and let's distinguish them, right? One is the idea that markets clear, that demand and supply matches, okay? There's no shortage or glut for long periods of time. The price system somehow makes sure that these things are eliminated fairly quickly. Under socialism, central command, one of the main features were shortages, things like bread lines, there were long bread queues. If you see films on the old Soviet Union, you will see that. There's this little joke which Ronald Reagan once said. This is before the fall of the Soviet Union, right? This is the early 1980s. So the joke goes like this, that there was if you wanted to buy a car, very few people could afford cars in the old Soviet Union. But if you wanted a car and had the money, you still had a long wait, right? Because there was no price system to clear the market. So that you may have to wait for years before, even after making the payment. So the story goes that a guy went to the car dealer, to the car outlet, the state's car outlet, paid the money and said, when can I get my car? And they said, come back in 10 years. Right? And the guy replied, morning or afternoon. So the car dealer said, 10 years from now, what difference does it make, morning or afternoon? And the guy says that, well, I also asked the plumber to come and he'll come in the morning, right? So from plumbers to cars to all kinds of goods, you could have these huge waiting times. And that's because the price system was not allowed to function. So that's one property of markets, that there's sort of quick market clearance. But that itself couldn't be a very big social goal, right? So what if markets clear? If it doesn't promote welfare in a way, then just market clearance in itself is not a big deal. That's where this second idea comes, and this is captured in the famous invisible hand quote, and the kind of analytical mathematical results that we proved. You will see more general versions of that, as I said, in the second half of this course, after you study general equilibrium with multiple markets clearing simultaneously. So the idea there is that in this very particular sense of Pareto efficiency, markets lead to some sort of Pareto efficient allocation. Now, that is not to say that the allocation created by the market is desirable, is excellent from various other issues, from other perspectives. It merely says that the allocation which the market creates has the property that if we are having a debate about whether to change that allocation, we have to face ethical questions. I think that's that's the way I read the first welfare theorem. It does not say that whatever the market brings about is bliss, that it's the best of all possible worlds. That interpretation would be extremely off, right? The interpretation is that the markets lead to some sort of Pareto efficient allocation. So if we want to change it, we have to have an ethical debate about how to weigh the interests of different peoples in society. Because if you want to improve somebody's lot, we have to hurt somebody else, right? Now, I can be perfectly happy saying that, I want to make the poor better off at the cost of billionaires, right? I may be quite comfortable making that argument, but I have to make arguments of that sort if I have to make an argument of intervening in the markets by governments. Now, I'll say more about that. I'll come back to this ethical issue. Yeah. The general intuition here is that the price system, let me bring in another angle here. Uh, as you saw in those little mathematical results that we proved, you have the allocation created by the market, and then you have the planner's allocation. Yes. Um, and we saw that the two allocations are the same, at least as far as the physical quantities are concerned. Right. That's what led us to this discussion. Now, why can't we turn around and say that, well, okay, you're praising markets over here as leading to some sort of good allocation, uh, but the planner can do the same, right? So we have a tie between capitalism and socialism, if you will, right? So either system could suffice. Whatever the market can do, the planner can also do, and what the planner will want to do and what the market will do happen to be the same in this context, again, with respect to quantities. So what's the big deal? We can either have the free market system or we can have a planned economy, right? Um, so how do we respond to that? Anybody?
So it's difficult to know all the variables for a planner while the market automatically adjusts it.
Yeah. So if you now think about the informational requirements, right, that are embedded in the simple comparison that we did a few slides back, when we are analyzing the market, we basically assume that consumers know their own utility function and firms know their own cost functions, and everybody gets to see the market price, right? That's a fairly reasonable requirement. I mean, we might think that it would be satisfied for most people. We know what we ourselves want, and as producers of some good, we know what it takes to produce that. Whereas for the planner to to solve that maximization problem that we set up and to implement it, the planner has to know everybody's utility function and every firm's cost function. We assume that, right? Now, if you go back and examine that assumption, that's a huge assumption. That's a very bold assumption. In a country of millions of people, that would be outlandish, right? So in general, the planner in reality will not have all that information at his fingertips. And so therefore, although theoretically the planner can mimic what the market can do, in practice, because of informational limitations, the planner will typically fail and will make mistakes, right? So the comparison that we did was kind of a benchmark. If you bring in the informational limitations of the planner, then the planner will fall short, actually. Yes. So that's another way to look at some of the virtues of the market, which is that it aggregates the information about utility and cost from millions of participants through their own decisions, right? Information aggregation is decentralized instead of some central body trying to collect all this information, which would be a huge task and pretty much an impossible task.
Excuse me, sir.
Yeah.
So talking about the informational ways that we are like putting out an argument that a social planner may not have the information
Right.
to make the right decision. But
Yeah.
at the same time, even if we depend on the invisible hands, as we said,
Mhm.
e- even these decisions are ultimately made by producers and consumers.
Right.
So should we rely on the fact that they have the complete and the correct information to be able to make the market adjust the right way?
Well, the thing is, I mean, we are merely assuming that they have the correct information about themselves, right? All we are requiring when we are analyzing market outcomes and doing our demand supply analysis and equilibrium analysis is that the consumers know their own utility function, what they themselves want, and the firms know their own cost conditions. Right now, especially on the firm side, you could say that sometimes, if it's a new product, for example, we're talking about vaccines, and billions of dollars being spent on vaccines, that maybe they make mistakes. But even at the firm level, the guy who's, the engineers and the managers who will produce it, if they make some mistakes, what's the hope that, the high command, which is essentially asking the information from them, will not make the same mistake, right? The Central Politburo, the Finance Ministry, what have you, they'll have to collect the information from the firms. So if the firms misjudge something, then it'll percolate all the way up. And as far as consumers are concerned, I mean, who knows their own wants and needs better than consumers themselves? Yeah. So,
Yes, sir.
yeah,
Sir,
yeah.
So I was saying that how does the producers, how do the producer can actually make correct analysis about the valuations that consumer put to a particular product?
That's
Because
exactly the heart of what we're talking about here, right? In a market economy, the producers don't know have to know what consumers want, what goods they prefer, whether they like cars of this color or that color. They don't have to. The price system sends out those signals, right? If the price of a good is high, that implicitly is telling producers that consumers value this a lot and they're willing to pay a high price. So go and produce it, go and expand your production of this good, right?
okay,
So it's the signals emitted by the prices which is transferring all this information from one side of the market to the other side.
So coming back to asymmetric information,
Right.
so in the real world, obviously, more powerful and like more resourceful people would have more information than the others. So they would take advantage and sort of create more inequality, I feel. So don't you think that free market equilibrium that we talk about and the efficiencies we talk about anyway cannot be attained, and for that reason probably intervention from government would be a good idea, because information asymmetry is a real thing. I mean, it is available at every stage in the
Yes.
economy.
Okay, so I'm coming to
also,
all
sir,
of yeah.
also, sir, just adding to her question, and also,
Right.
sir, the invisible hand that Adam Smith talks about, sir, I think it's more of a classical economics thing, and it assumes that prices and wages are perfectly flexible. On the other hand, we observe in real life that they're not actually that flexible, that they change so soon. There's a bit of friction when it comes to changing the variables. So why do we still say that the market allocates all the resources properly and puts
Okay.
them to their best use?
Okay. So uh, let me. All of these, I'm just about to going to, right now, I will touch upon some of these issues. Let me take a step back and say the following. The way the study of microeconomics goes these days, right, is that you'll have this course like this, which sort of explores classical ideas, yes, and there the general sort of tenor of our discussion is somewhat pro-market, right? There are lots of caveats and qualifiers we're still throwing, but in some sense, we first come to praise markets, as it were, right? This is as Mark Antony said in Shakespeare's Julius Caesar play, that I come to bury Caesar, not to praise Caesar. So we first come and praise markets, right? That's how we begin. And then as the study of microeconomics progresses, especially when you go from microeconomics 1 to microeconomics 2 and study game theory and asymmetric information, the tone changes, and then we become much more critical. We see a million kind of reasons, not a million, whatever, dozens of reasons why markets may stutter and fail and stumble, and we find more and more theoretical reasons why government has a role to play in regulating markets, in intervening in markets, right? Now, that's how it will proceed, okay? That's going to be the sort of course or the arc of our journey in the sequence of microeconomics courses, first of all. Secondly, even without asking you to wait for another several months, I will talk about some of the issues that you guys are raising. All right. So actually, let me skip from this discussion to that first. Uh, um, um, no, okay, I'll come back to that later. Let me not change the sequence. First, let me talk about a few things, right? I will address exactly the points that you raised, all right? Uh, all right, first, let's talk about the deadweight laws of taxation. Again, most of you kind of know this. I'll go through it quite quickly. So suppose this is a free market, no taxes, no regulation, nothing. Equilibrium price and quantity are P0, Q0, okay? Screen. All right. Now, suppose the government imposes a tax on this market, right? What do we have to do? Let's say it's a sales tax on sellers, right? That means the supply curve will shift. In which direction will it shift?
Up,
Up
upward.
or to the left, right? So suppose the tax is T per unit. That means that, well, before we do the shift, this is before tax, this is consumer surplus, this is producer surplus, right? And now there's a tax of T per unit, so the supply curve shifts up by the amount T everywhere. So now the new equilibrium is this, right? As a function of T, right? Bigger is the tax, the bigger will be these shifts. So now in the new situation, let's look at all the surpluses and add them up. So this blue is our consumer surplus, right? Area between the demand curve and the price which is relevant to consumers. What is the producer surplus? Well, it's this pink area, right? Now, we are not done because the government has collected some tax revenues, and that is not necessarily, money down the drain, because the government can build roads, bridges, improve infrastructure, do various things which are of use to us. So the government's tax collection is this green area, right? Tax revenue. So that money is not lost. That remains as part of social surplus. But now this is the sum of these three is the social surplus, right? But previously we know that social surplus was this bigger triangle, okay? So this part of it, which is now colored black, this part of social surplus is lost because of the tax, right? So this is what is called deadweight loss. Every time we have a tax imposed on the market, fortunes change, consumers, producers, everybody's affected, their surpluses change, but the sum of the surplus to society shrinks because of the tax. So that's called the deadweight loss of taxation. Yes. Now, you have to be carefully interpreting that. Does that mean that there should never be taxes, that all taxes should be set to zero for the purpose of economic efficiency? No, that's not the point. So let's say that, the government is thinking of building a new bridge, and the government has to raise the cost of building the bridge will be 100 rupees, let's say, right? So now there's a debate, there's a policy debate going on whether the bridge ought to be built or not, right? Whether it's worth it. Now, the idea is that, okay, if you want to do cost benefit analysis, we can go and assess people's valuation of the bridge. We can ask all the citizens, how much is this bridge worth to you, right? Ignore for now the fact that they may misrepresent their values. They may not respond truthfully. Suppose they're all truth tellers, right? So somebody says it is worth 20 rupees to me. I would be willing to pay up to 20 rupees. Somebody says 30 rupees. Somebody says 40 rupees. So we add it all up, right? That's how we evaluate some public good, like a bridge. So suppose the value of the bridge comes out to be 130 rupees, let's say, right? And the literal cost of building the bridge is 100 rupees, right? So if you're not being very careful in doing our cost benefit analysis, we would say, oh, the total value is 130 and the cost of building it is 100. So there's a profit of 30. So as a society, we should go ahead and build the bridge. As an economist, you should at that point step in and say, no, 100 is not the cost, because to raise those 100 rupees for building the bridge, taxes have to be levied, and that will create distortions and deadweight loss. So we have to measure what the deadweight loss of those extra taxes are, right? And suppose the deadweight loss of the taxes works out, meaning this, this black area, suppose it works out to be, let's say, 40 rupees, okay? So the literal cost of building the bridge is 100 rupees, and its deadweight loss is 40 rupees, so overall 140, and the benefit to citizens is 130. In this situation, the bridge shouldn't be built, okay? But if the deadweight loss worked out to be 20 rupees, right, so you add that to 100, so 120 is the overall cost, including the deadweight loss, and then the value in that case, 130, exceeds the cost, and in that case, we can go ahead and build the bridge. That would be the right decision. So the lesson for all of this is not that, taxes should always be eliminated or kept down to the lowest possible politically feasible level. The lesson is that to raise money for any project or any kind of government expenditure, the government has to not only count the cost of the project, but also the deadweight loss of the taxes that are involved. And that's a real thing, this deadweight loss. All right. Questions? Okay. So there are other kinds of interventions that one can think of. If there's a price ceiling like this, if the government says that prices cannot be raised above a certain level, for example, rent control, which exist in some cities, some neighborhoods, then that leads to excess demand, as we can tell from the picture, right? The equilibrium market clearing price would have been higher since the price is not allowed to get to that level. Demand and supply don't match, so we have an excess demand or a shortage. And in terms of welfare, how do we measure the consequence of this price ceiling? Well, it's again this shaded area, right? If prices were allowed to go to equilibrium, then this big triangle would have been the social surplus. But since the price is restricted here, the quantity will be this amount, right? Whichever is the less of demand and supply, that will be the amount that is produced and traded. And so quantity is here, and it's the quantity which determines what the loss of social surplus is, right? This part of potential social surplus is lost because of the price ceiling. Yeah. Now, let's take the case of rent control. Yeah. Does this mean that it's a bad idea? That rent control is unambiguously bad, and we as economists should give an unqualified recommendation against it? It's not that simple, okay? Because if there's rent control, then yes, some of the people looking for housing won't find it, okay? So compared to the equilibrium situation, some people may be worse off. In the equilibrium, they had to pay more, but at least they could find the housing they're looking for. Here, they're not able to find it. So some people could be worse off because of that. But people who actually find housing at the controlled rent are better off relative to the equilibrium situation, right? So starting from a free market, if the government introduces rent control, the effect on tenants is not simple. One group of tenants become better off because they're paying less. Another group of tenants become worse off because they cannot find housing in the first place. Yes. So once again, we have to weigh the interests of different people in order to assess what the effect of the rent control is.
Charge the rent more so that they can satisfy their own interests.
Sorry. Sorry, could you repeat the question again?
And audible, sir?
Yes, you're audible now.
Sir, so the tenants can actually increase the rent, so that they can increase their surplus, and so the price ceiling in that case will fail illegally, I mean.
Yes. So sometimes what happens is that, when the government is trying to control prices through like a price ceiling or a price floor, you also have to ask the question whether this is enforceable. Yes. Whether it doesn't create an underground black market. Yes. So there's a I don't remember if I have thrown it into the problem set, but I'll give you a problem where the question asks that suppose such a price ceiling is imposed, and suppose the government cannot stop the black market, then what happens, right? And there, all the tenants may become worse off, right? So well-meaning though it is, the rent control may actually boomerang on the interests of tenants as a whole, not just one subset of them, but all of them, if a black market appears, right? So you're absolutely right there. That will be a greater concern to think about. Similarly, yes.
Sir, can you please just show this slide for price ceiling again?
Yeah.
Sir, I really couldn't get it why the shaded area is the loss. So loss of social surplus.
Okay, so first imagine that we have a free market, right? So you have equilibrium at the intersection of demand and supply. And in that case, what's the social surplus? It's basically this triangle, right?
Yes.
All the area included between the demand and supply curves, right? Up to this point. Now, suppose there's a price ceiling so at this level, okay? So what will be the quantity produced and purchased? That will be QD,
yes.
The lesser of demand and supply at the regulated price, right? So this is the quantity, and now I'll try to avoid not opening up my whiteboard again. But consumer surplus will be the area on the demand curve above the price line. So it's this portion of it, right? And producer surplus will be the area above the supply curve and below the price line. So this part of it. So the overall social surplus is this area, right? The sum of this and that. And notice that compared to the equilibrium situation, this area is now missed out. It is not part of social surplus anymore. So that's the deadweight loss.
And one more thing, sir. Since QD would be supplied in the equilibrium because it is the less of QD and QS. Right. So QD is what is demanded and QS is what is supplied. So if supply is more than demand, why is it a shortage?
Okay, you can think of various kinds of goods and services here. So think of this as a market for, let's say, a service like dentists. Okay, so the government has said dentists cannot charge more than a certain price. Now, in the case of dentists, the service is only supplied when somebody walks through the door, right? So yes, the dentist would like to supply this much, but they cannot anyway.
Yes, sir, I understood, but there is no shortage then, right? Because the demand is less than the supply.
Let me finish my explanation. So now compare that with, let's say onions, okay? So suppose there's a price ceiling on onions. It's possible that although consumers only want to buy this amount, that suppliers will actually end up producing more, right? Because they're small players, they don't know if they are, that they might hope that they'll be able to sell at this price. So in the case of a physical commodity where the production takes place before consumption, right? There you can actually have overshooting. Okay. So for the purpose of this picture, let's think of this as a service, not as something like onions. All right. Again, I think I'll cook up a problem set question for you where you can think of the other case and actually do some calculations about, how much overshooting of production may take place in the case of physical commodities like onions, which are produced beforehand. But for now, let's think of it as like dentist services, right? Now, this extra, then this entire amount, this gap between demand and supply, none of it will actually be produced because they can't produce it until somebody wants to buy it, right? Now, you're saying, why is that a shortage? It's a shortage in a hypothetical sense, right? Suppliers, dentists at the regulated price would want to, whatever, sell this much. Sorry, this is mislabeled. This should be supply and this should be demand.
Yes, sir.
This is mislabeled. I took it from the book, from some book, and just mislabeled it. So,
Okay.
right? So in this case, there's excess demand. But your question could be asked if you had a price floor instead of a ceiling, right? There you could ask the question that, this excess supply that you're talking about, it's not actually produced. So what does it mean? It is excess supply in the sense of intention that, at that high regulated price floor, the sellers would like to sell more. They're keen to sell more, but they're not able to. Okay, so that's the sense in which there's excess supply.
Yes, sir.
Sir, I have a doubt.
Yeah.
How do we know that a market is in equilibrium or not?
Well, the classical theory we are looking at says, and that's the content of the theory, it says that, if the government doesn't put in legal restrictions and regulations like this, prices always adjust to the equilibrium level, right?
So equilibrium is static or dynamic?
For the purpose of our discussion, it is static. Okay, we can all extend all of this into dynamic settings. The gist of your question is that maybe the theory is wrong, right? Maybe even if the government stays away and doesn't want to regulate, maybe still in the real world, prices won't adjust to the level where demand supply are equal. Okay, now I said, I think last week at the very outset that there are theories of endogenous price rigidity in some markets like credit markets, and they happen for informational reasons, right? People like Joseph Stiglitz have developed models where prices do not adjust to equilibrium levels for very logical, strong reasons. We are starting simple, right? So in simple markets like, market for vegetables, agricultural commodities, grains and so on, it's difficult to think of reasons why the market may not clear. In any case, in the theory that we are dealing with, it's part of the theory which says that the prices will always adjust to market clearing level, right? That is not always true in the real world. That is not true of other theories which are intended for certain special markets. But we are proceeding on this discussion assuming that, right? Okay, so similarly quotas and all. Now, when we come to some of the points that you guys were already raising, that there are implicit assumptions, even when we talk about that Pareto optimality kind of thing, there are implicit assumptions which we didn't spell out. If those assumptions are not valid, then even in this very narrow and concrete sense of Pareto optimality, the assertion that markets lead to Pareto optimal allocations will be untrue. It will be false. Markets will leave the opportunity of making everyone better off without making somebody worse off, right? That is possible if any of these conditions are violated or if any of these alternative conditions are present. So what are these conditions? So again, I won't get into sort of elaborate treatment of these at this point. Let me just mention them conceptually. One is externalities, okay? What are externalities? This is when one person's act of production or consumption affects another person's utility, right? So if you're having a party of your friends at home at night, late at night, and you're playing loud music and creating a lot of racket, and your neighbor cannot sleep, that's a negative externality, yes? Your act of consumption is lowering somebody else's welfare. There could be positive externalities. People have argued that education may be a positive externality. If you are more educated, you can help out others or give them advice with the help of your education. So you can impose a positive externality on others. Now, when externalities are present, take the case of negative externalities. The classic case is that of pollution. Certain industries which create pollution, they impose cost on others. Their healthcare costs go up. They can damage crops in the neighboring land of farmers. They can kill the fish if they're releasing their pollutants in the water. Uh, the So their private cost of production, which consists of wages and rents and so on and so forth, their private costs of production are less than the overall social cost. The social cost should not only count the wage cost and raw material cost of production, but also the, let's say, the health cost on others, right? And the private producer is not internalizing that, so to speak. He's not counting part of the social cost that he doesn't have to bear. So therefore, what happens when you have negative externalities and you leave it to a free market is that there's overproduction. The socially optimum amount is less than what the market ends up producing. And when you have positive externalities, there's underproduction, that the socially optimum amount would be larger than what people do from private incentives. What is the solution? The solution is taxes and subsidies, right? So if you have negative externalities, there are polluting industries and they're overproducing in a free market. One way to cut that back and bring down production to the socially optimum level is to use what is called Pigouvian taxes, right? So the government carefully sort of measures out things and imposes an appropriate tax, which, as we saw before, if you impose a tax on sellers, the in equilibrium quantity produced would fall. So that's how you can eliminate the gap between privately optimal market production and socially optimum production levels. I'll quickly sort of run through the list. We can come back to some of these issues and discuss them in more detail later. Another situation in which markets won't do a very good job is the case of public goods. So what are public goods? These are goods which have two features. A pure public good is a good which has two features. One is that it's non-rival in consumption, right? So one person's consumption does not reduce another person's consumption. So if I have an apple and if I eat the apple, of course you cannot eat the apple, right? So an apple or a food item is rivalrous. But if there's a nice park in our neighborhood and I'm going and taking a walk in the park, you can also at the same time enjoy your a walk in the park, unless it becomes really overcrowded, right? So that's what it means to be non-rival. The park is non-rival, but the apple is rival. The other feature which public goods have is non-excludability, right? So take national defense. If there's a strong army which protects the country, the army cannot discriminate. The army cannot, protect you and not protect me. It's protecting the whole country, all the citizens at the same time. If the air is cleaned up, every year we have this pollution problem in Delhi. So if measures are taken and the air is cleaned up, then it's clean for everyone. There's no way to make Delhi clean for half the citizens and unclean for the other half. So that feature is non-excludable, right? So a good which is non-rival as well as non-excludable is a pure public good. And the classic understanding is that markets are not very good in providing pure public goods because how can you price it? Because of the free rider problem, right? If others are paying for it, I don't want to pay for it because I can just free ride, right? If other citizens are contributing to clean up Delhi's air, I might just as well, refrain from contributing and just enjoy the clean air when it comes about. So you need government and its coercive taxation powers to do things like, police and army and public goods like that. Now, I'm not spending much time on these because, most of you have seen this in the undergraduate level. So I'll just tick the boxes and I want to come to kind of questions that some of you were raising, right? I want to get there quickly. The other is imperfect competition. So we assumed in our analysis that it's a perfectly competitive market. In particular, buyers and sellers are price takers. They take the market price as given. They assume that their own decisions of demand and supply will not feed back on that market price. Now that would be true for certain markets, like maybe the market for rice or wheat nationally, but it won't be true, for example, in the airline industry or in the car industry where there's a small number of suppliers. So if Indigo is thinking that it wants to expand its footprint and its sales, they are aware that this will have an effect on airline prices and the pricing of tickets. So as we go through, in this course itself, we will talk about monopoly. So we'll see it there. And then in the next course, you will talk about oligopoly using game theory. And there you will see these effects that, when you have imperfect competition, the Pareto efficiency property of markets breaks down and some role for government is called for. Now, this is what I want to spend the remaining time. Oh, God. Now, suppose all these factors that have been taken care of, right? So yes, if there's imperfect competition in some markets, if there's monopoly or duopoly, markets won't do everything right. If you have, for public goods like, maybe roads and highways, and certainly for police and fire brigade, we have to rely on government, not markets. And for polluting industries and other externalities, the government has to step in with taxes and some sort of regulation. Now, suppose all of that has been done, right? Externalities have been corrected through appropriate taxes. Public goods have been efficiently provided by government, and imperfect competition has been solved, through antitrust regulations by the Competition Bureau, which, if an industry was too much concentrated, more competition was created, let's say. Now, does that mean that government's job is finished? That now we should leave everything to free markets, right? Not necessarily, not at all. There's no such implication. Because one reason why governments often intervene in markets and move away from a completely free market is equity, not efficiency, right? Efficiency means we are on the Pareto frontier, but there are many different points on the Pareto frontier. Some points of the Pareto frontier may be extremely unequal, right? It may involve a lot of people going hungry, not even able to meet their basic needs, and some people having obscene amounts of wealth, and we may not like that, right? So income redistribution is often a reason why governments intervene in markets, right? And it's a perfectly legitimate, honorable reason. We can have a debate about it, whether we have too much inequality or not, but it's a perfectly legitimate reason to try and change the market allocation. Now, let me go beyond that and talk about a few issues which I wanted to flag, right? There's a book by Michael Sandel, a philosopher, an American philosopher, 2012, called Markets and Morals. And the main point of Sandel's book is that, there's a culture worldwide, and especially he's talking of America, but also globally to some extent, that that markets are the magic bullet solution to all our social problems, that sort of thing, right? That there's an ethos which gives markets such a central place that it does not warrant. Here are some examples from Sandel's book, right? Social interactions and exchanges which have been marketized and monetized, which in his view shouldn't have been, right? Now, some examples are obvious. You can't buy friendship or love or respect or admiration, obviously, right? There are other markets which have always been controversial, and sweatshop labor, prostitution, organ sales, and so on, right? But here are some nice exotic examples which Mark Sandel gives. There are schools in certain American states, like Texas, for example, where they pay the children to read a book. If the child comes in and says, okay, I've read Oliver Twist and passes the quiz, the child gets $10, right? So this is supposed to incentivize the child to read the book. Other examples you could see, there's a tradition, people write wedding toasts in Western societies. They give a short speech. It's supposed to be funny and engaging. Some people find it difficult to do, so they can go on certain websites, pay a fee, and they'll write the wedding toast for them and customize it to them for their needs. Many hospitals in America have this sort of two-track system, right? So if you pay a high annual subscription fee, then if you get sick, you can go to the hospital and you don't have to wait in a long line or have a long waiting time. They'll fast track you. And if you pay the normal fee, then you have to sit in the waiting room or you have to wait for months for your surgery and so on and so forth, right? So in all of these cases, Sandel is saying that these are not good things. And the point that he makes, his objection, he's coming from two different angles, right? One is he's saying that if we allow everything to be priced, then sometimes putting a price on something and trying to exchange it through markets leads to corruption. Corruption not in the sense of bribery. It undermines the very thing which we are trying to exchange or pay for, right? I'll say more about that. The other objection that he raises is that if we again leave everything to markets, then it can create inequality. And what Michael Sandel is suggesting is that, in certain domains, we may not hate inequality so much. Yeah. If private jets are very unequally distributed in society, then maybe we'll say, okay, fine, but if healthcare is very unequally distributed, right? What that might mean is that, the rich person can, doctors and hospital resources may give priority to cosmetic surgery for rich people instead of heart surgery for poor people, right? Poor people may be dying of heart attacks, but the hospital resources, beds, surgeons are being bid away by rich people for, changing their face. Now, is that the kind of inequality that we are comfortable with? That's Sandel's point. Now, let me give you a little bit of indication of the second point here, corruption, that if everything is put through markets and the price system, sometimes we can see examples where things get corrupted. Okay, here's a paper by Nisi and Rusticchini in the QJE. It's a very interesting experiment, has been talked about a lot. So it's an experiment on these daycare centers in Israel, right? There were 10 daycare centers which were studied here. And they had this chronic problem that parents would come late to pick up the children. So the daycare gets over at 4 o'clock and some parents would show up at 4:30 and 5. So the daycare center workers and teachers have to stay overtime until the parents arrive. Right? So they experiment with the idea of introducing prices and markets here, right? So basically they said, okay, let's put some fines. You want to come late, you have to pay a price for it, right? And so fines were introduced, and they did a randomized control trial, RCT. So first 4 weeks, none of these 10 centers had any fines. In the middle, weeks 5 and 6, 6 of them had fines and 4 of them didn't have fines. And then weeks 7 onwards, once again, the fines were withdrawn. So the idea is that, by looking at those daycare centers which randomly were chosen to have fines for 3 weeks in the middle, if you look at their rate of absenteeism and you compare it with the average rate of absenteeism, that will tell you what is the effect of the fine. Okay, so let me show you what the data showed. All right. The white points are the control group, meaning these are daycare centers which never had fines. These are week numbers, right? Weeks 1 through 20. The black curve is the groups who faced the fine in weeks 5 to 7, right, in this first part. So the remarkable thing is that once the price was introduced, instead of the rate of absenteeism coming down, it actually went up. And moreover, even after the fines were withdrawn, these daycare centers, which once experienced fines, the rate of absenteeism there stayed up. It didn't come down, even after the fines were introduced, right? So that's exactly the opposite of what we would expect. Yes, so the price, okay, so think of late coming as something which busy parents, it's something that they demand, right? So previously the price was 0 and they had a certain amount of late coming. If the price goes up, coming late is expensive, so you would expect by the law of demand that the fraction of parents who came late would actually go down, but it moves in the opposite direction. Let me show you another experiment.
Sir, I have a small question with respect to this experiment.
Yes.
Sir, is it possible perhaps that the experimenters have underpriced the fine? Perhaps it is possible that the market rate for them having to put their kids for another hour post the daycare center is maybe $30.
Sure.
And fine is perhaps thus a lot more cheaper.
Okay. So if they didn't manage to eliminate late coming through their fines, that wouldn't be surprising at all, right? So if previously 20% of the parents came late and after the fine 5% are still coming late, then what you said exactly could be our response that, okay, yeah, they introduced a fine, but it just wasn't high enough. They had to raise it further if they want to bring it down to 0. But what they found is that instead of 20% coming down to 5%, let alone 0%, it went up to 30%, right? So what is surprising is not that late coming didn't disappear. What is surprising is that even after the fine came in, late coming actually went up instead of down. And that you cannot explain using the sort of standard economic models of, simple models that we have been talking about.
So probably this talks more about morality, like sort of they felt less guilty coming later, and so there was a trade-off.
Okay, sir, got it. Thank you.
Yeah. Yes, let me just, I've badly mismanaged the time. Can I go on for, let's say, another 10 minutes? Is there a strong objection? Do you have a class after this?
Yes, sir. So we do not have any lectures post this. So I think it would be okay.
Okay, so with your indulgence, I will take another few minutes to wrap this up because it will be awkward to keep it hanging. So if you please give me a little bit of your time. Here's another experiment. Let me show you this. Also very, very interesting. Yeah, let me, for the sake of time, just skip to the experiment first. Okay, so this Swedish medical school, they asked for blood donations, right? They had a huge, it's a university which has a medical school. So they took their students and solicited them for donating blood, right? Now, sure, in the study, there were these 262 subjects. They were all undergraduate students at the university. And they were divided into 3 groups, right? To the first group, which is treatment 1, no rewards were offered. They were just asked, do you want to give blood or not? It will be used for blood transfusions for patients. The second group were told that if you give blood, you will get to the equivalent of $7 US. So that's like, 2 cups of good coffee. Yeah. The third group were told, and by the way, people were randomly assigned to these three groups, right? There was no systematic pattern to who was put in which group. So the third group was told that, well, we'll pay, if you give blood, we'll pay to the tune of $7, but we won't pay to your pocket, we'll give it to some charity of your choice, right? You can tell us which charity organization, like UNICEF or World Wildlife Fund, whatever you want, we'll pay to them. Okay, so now, what would you expect to be the responses? In which group will you find the maximum response, right? And in which group the lowest?
Group 2. Group number 2, maximum.
Yes, right? If you think of this as a supply curve, we have been talking about supply curves being positively sloped, right? The higher the price you pay, the more is the supply which is forthcoming. So group 1 was offered a zero price. Group 2 was offered a positive price, so their response should be higher. And group 3 was offered a price which is somewhere in between, in the sense that, they're getting paid of some value, but they're not free to use it the way they want, right? So the first group, if they wanted to give it to charity, they're still free to do so. If they want to use the money themselves, they're free to do so. The second group has a more restricted reward, right? So you can think of price being zero here, price being less than $7 here, and price being $7 here. So you would imagine that the ranking would be lowest supply response from group 1, followed by group 3, followed by group 2. Group 2 would be the highest, right? That's what our standard model tells. So here's what the data show. Now, in this picture, they break it up by gender, right? So the white bars are for males. Now, for males, you actually don't find any surprise. For the female subjects, you find something very interesting, which is that when the payments are being made, supply actually is much lower. So if you see, if it's purely voluntary, no prices being offered, 50% chose to donate blood. When they're offered money, only 30% chose to do so, right? So once again, our usual supply curve is completely thrown haywire, right? Higher price, less supply. So what may be going on? So I talk about this at much greater length in the optional course, which I teach next year, but let me sort of give you an intuitive suggestion or two, and then I can also take other ideas from you guys, which is that it's not too hard to think of what may be going on, right? In the case of the blood donation.
So can you explain this graph again?
Look at the black graphs, right? So these are the three groups or the three treatments. This is no payment, right? The group which was not offered any money for donating blood, 50% of them donated blood in the sort of female part of the group. The group which was offered money and they could pocket the money, in that group, only 30% said yes to blood donation. And the group where they were offered $7 to a charity of their choice, their response rate climbed back to 50% again. So in the case where the highest price was being paid, so to speak, for giving blood, the supply of blood donation was the lowest in that group by a significant margin. Yes?
So perhaps can we answer this with the idea of altruism? That
okay, so
there is perhaps utility to altruism.
Okay, now that is tricky because, see, of course, when no money is offered, half the people are giving blood. What could that be? Well, of course, they are generous and they care and they're altruistic. They want to help their fellow human beings. Now, for the second group, there are for the first group, there's only one reason for them to give blood, which is altruism. For the second group, there are two reasons to give blood. altruism plus money. So why would you give less blood? You should give more, right? Your altruism has been given a boost with these payments, right? So we are not scratching our heads why half the people are giving blood without any payments. We're not wondering about that. We're wondering why, when you add payments to that, it falls from 50 to 30%.
Sir, I think adding payment would create a market where the equilibrium would be determined in group 2.
Yes, but what could be the psychological reason? I mean, of course, it's creating a market. That's by definition. But why does that reduce blood donation?
Or it could feel morally incorrect to accept payment for donating blood.
You could take the payment and give it to somebody else. You could then walk out and give it to the homeless person on the street.
So they would no longer have that selfless feeling that when they donated blood without any payments, perhaps.
So there's a paper by Benabu and Tirol, which I talk about at length. I show you the model or some simple version of the model in the compulsory course, in the optional course. The basic idea is that there is some amount of people help others, partly because of a genuine desire to help others, right? And partly because of maybe virtue signaling. We want to show others that we are generous, not selfish people. We even may want to tell ourselves that is the kind of person we are. So when I'm giving blood without money, the signal is clear. I'm doing a generous, virtuous act. When I'm giving blood and getting monetary payments, right, the signal gets jammed, right? Maybe I'm giving blood because of generosity, but maybe because I'm greedy and just a cheapskate that I'll do anything for, $50, right? That could be the inference. So that could be one potential reason why we see this sort of so-called surprising pattern, right? Now, let me get back to Sandel's point. What was he saying? He was saying that one of his objections to marketizing everything and putting a price on everything was corruption. That sometimes if we bring in prices and markets and monetary exchanges, the very thing which is being transacted degrades, right? So this generosity and the generosity signaling out of which people were giving blood, it got weakened and degraded because we brought in prices and a market, so to speak, to increase the supply. Yeah. Now, the other point which Sandel makes in his book is this inequality. Let me very quickly show you some graphs which I prepared. Okay. Inequality in the US. And you may have seen these graphs in articles, it may not. They came out terribly. I'll before I post the revised slides, I will correct them. But the blue graph is the income share of the top 1% of the US population, right? And it starts in 1915 and it goes to like 2013, 14, right? So you can see this is the long-term graph, right? This is the top 1%, this is the top 0.1%, right? The red one. So inequality, the share of the very top was very high. So it was around the quarter before. This is, you won't be able to read it now, but this is just up to the Great Depression, right? After the Great Depression, with the reforms, with New Deal, this started falling. And then it hits this lowest point around 1980, and then it starts climbing very steeply. And now it's almost back to the Depression era level, right? So you can see this massive U-shaped curve where inequality went down for several decades and then has been climbing for the last 4 decades. Same with the top of this thing. If you look at this, is the second graph is the relative growth of after-tax income for the different percentiles. This is the top 0.01%, this is the 0.1%, this is the top 1%, this is the 90 to 98, right? The remaining part of the top 10%. And so we are going down the ladder, right? And look at the rate of growth, right? So their incomes in 1970 are all normalized to 100% for their group. And at the bottom end, in the bottom half, incomes have hardly grown in the last 50 years, half a century, right? Very little growth. And look at the thin slices at the top, right? So massive increases in income inequality. It's deriving from two different sources. One is that the share of labor in GDP has been going down, as this graph shows. So that's part of the reason. More and more share of GDP go to capital. And the other is that even within labor, the top end, like the highly educated skilled workers, their wages have been growing at a decent clip. But it's the blue collar workers at the end, people who have not gone to college, people who, either finished high school or just dropped out of school. Their wage growth has been, at the very bottom end, some of that has declined over long periods of time. So it's a combination of these two things. So inequality is a very pressing problem in the world. And if we create a policy like, open up to free trade or what have you, that may take us to the Pareto frontier. Suppose we are inside the Pareto frontier and we adopt a policy which will take us to the Pareto frontier. But if it creates this kind of inequality in the process, then it is absolutely legitimate for people to say that, well, this wasn't a change for the better, right? So either we have to complement things like free trade policies with serious efforts at income redistribution, or we have to maybe temper our enthusiasm for free trade and markets, deregulation of markets, and so on and so forth. So the income distribution is something that we have to keep our eyes on, and we'll talk more about that as we go along. Questions? Any questions?
So adding to what you said for those experiments, obviously, like for example, in such cases where it's more about altruism than economic incentives, so social or moral incentives work better than economic incentives. For example, I don't know, a while back I was reading somewhere about in-mail votes, like you post the votes. So the turnout of the number of votes that you got when they just mailed were much lower than when it's like at a place where people interact and socially meet, and sort of social obligation that they show to others. So that worked better where they knew who was voting instead of just voting.
Yes. So there have been experiments where people's voting behavior or track record, whether they were voted or not, has been made. Sort of that information has been disseminated. And the general gist is that it's seen as a social duty. So when people are aware that they'll be seen not voting or skipping their votes, then they participate more. In the case of voting, exactly. What you say. So the general point is, this has been referred to as crowding out. Okay, human beings are not entirely selfish, right? We care about others, we care about our social duties, and so on. Maybe we don't care enough, right? So there's always a problem that at the individual level we are not absolutely selfish. We are not absolute saints and altruists. We are somewhere in the middle. We have some altruistic impulses and we have some selfish impulses, and maybe the selfish impulses are stronger than altruistic impulses, but altruistic impulses are there. So in the literature they call it crowding out, that so-called pro-social activities like giving blood, like voting, is carried out because of some intrinsic motivation, because people have some desire to do their duty or to help others. When you're bringing in a price, the monetary incentive is interacting with the social incentive, right? And the interaction may turn out to be bad. It may turn out to be negative. That, okay, with money, you're shoring up the selfish money earning motive. But in the process, if the social motive weakens enough, then the net effect could go south instead of north, right? So if there's a strong crowding out effect, then we may have a counterproductive situation. You pay people to vote, they vote less. You pay people to give blood, they give less blood, and so on.
So, what would be the reason for relative share of labor going down compared to capital over a period of time, as well as what would be the reason for the differences in the different deciles of labor getting disproportionately different shares of the labor income itself?
That's a very interesting, very important, but very long discussion. Okay, so I'll try to curve out. I'm glad to see that some of you have your interest piqued by some of these graphs that I showed. Right now I have to end because I'm horribly over time, right? But I'll come back and try to curve out 5 or 10 minutes from another class quite soon, where we can talk more about these very important global developments, right? So some of the right-wing trends in politics, like the election of Donald Trump, for example, in 2016, have been many people have drawn a connection to these trends in inequality and the election of Trump or the Brexit vote in Britain. So I'll be happy to talk about it, but I'll have to carve out some time from some other lecture.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Ghosh, sir.
So, in the blood donation experiment, it's visible that the showing off that we are doing social service is prevalent in women, but it's not in men. Is that so?
Well, we are all guessing, right? I mean, it is in that particular study, it seems like there is some gender difference in behavior. Some other studies, similar sort of, we don't see that big a gender difference. Let's not focus on the gender difference so much. I took the graph from the paper, so it splits it up by gender. But it's whoever it applies to, and it does apply to a large subset of the respondents, this seemingly odd supply response, right? That there's less supply when the price is raised. So what is interesting to think about the possible motivations, right? And one possible motivation is that, what it means when you're doing a virtuous act for a price. It means less. It conveys less to others and maybe even to yourself about why you're doing it, right? So once again, the monetary incentive interferes with the sort of rich gamut of social incentives for acting in a way which is helpful to others.
Okay, sir, thank you.
Okay, guys, I'm way over time. I'm sorry that I didn't manage the time very well today. So we'll continue this discussion in the next class. Tomorrow I have to start on consumer theory, but we can fit in perhaps a few odds and ends of this discussion, which is very important about the how exactly do we see the role of markets in a society. Okay, so see you tomorrow in the morning. Bye, guys.
Bye, sir. Okay, sir. Thank you.